Welcome to The Extra on KRDO News Radio, the show that connects you with the topics and issues and people that are important to you. And two very important people in studio this morning from Hammond Law Group. Catherine Hammond is here, and with her special guest, Kent Mathews. And Kent, I was like, I'll just let you say which group you're with, because it's a very long title.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. I work at the Pikes Peak Area Council of Governments, the Area Agency on Aging, and what I do there is their Family Caregiver Support Center. I'm the caregiver specialist at the Area Agency on Aging.
Well, and I'm so glad, Catherine, that you brought Kent in, and this is an important topic, and we were kind of talking on these points, and we will talk about it as we go through the morning, but dementia and Alzheimer's, stuff like that, it touches so many lives. And so many people and families are affected by it, aren't they?
Absolutely. More than 5 million Americans have Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia right now. So
that's a staggering number.
Right.
And we were kind of touching on it, Ken, and I realize you're not a physician or anything like that,
right.
A neurologist.
Right.
But can it be kind of hard or challenging to diagnose dementia or Alzheimer's?
Yes. And part of it is how it's a slow onset. And I think the other reason that makes it difficult to diagnose is because it's not something visible. Like when somebody has a cancer or something like that, you can see that visibly on the outside of the body. But with dementia, it's on the inside, it's in the head, and that's not easy to see. And for family caregivers, a lot of the frustration and confusion comes from the fact that mom or dad are showing some memory loss, but they're thinking it's just typical memory loss. And so they miss the early stages when it's the most beneficial to do some planning and other kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. And there's Alzheimer's, right? Dementia, and there's several forms. Is there several forms of
There
Alzheimer's
are a lot
dementia?
of different kinds of dementia. Well, there's Lewy body.
There's vascular dementia. There's Huntington's chorea. There is dementia related to Parkinson's. There's dementia related to substance abuse.
Wow.
There's all
and even
kinds
depression. And
yeah.
when my mom was first in the process of being diagnosed, they were having a hard time nailing down, was it depression? She had a long history of depression, hospitalization for depression, and that kind of, slowly morphed into Alzheimer's. And so they had to figure out in terms of what to do for her, whether it was depression or Alzheimer's, and eventually they determined that it was Alzheimer's.
Well, and it's very important that both of you are here today because, Catherine, from personal experience, and Kent, you help with, caregiving and everything
right.
like that, planning and being ready for something like this. It's not like somebody wakes up someday and goes, hey, look, I have dementia or Alzheimer's, like you were saying, and we have a plan ready. But as soon as a diagnosis, and Catherine, you and I have talked about this before, as soon as it is diagnosed, then the motions can be made to start planning. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And that can make a huge difference in what the entire journey looks like.
So what planning ahead, and I see it in your notes, planning ahead instead of being reactive helps make for obviously a smoother experience. I'm sure the initial shock of finding out a family member has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia, but you have to get through that, right, and move forward and start making a plan.
Right. And there are some areas in terms of like financially, and that can be a challenge because sometimes the parent doesn't want the children to know their financial stuff, but it's important to know the financial. It's important for everybody to begin to understand medically what's going on, the progression of the dementia, what might be occurring. Housing issues are often an issue, and also emotional issues as well. It's very hard. It's very fearful for the person who's been given that diagnosis to face that, and it's also very difficult emotionally for the adult children to begin to face that as well. So there are challenges.
Yeah, and it sounds, and Catherine, we have kind of touched on this before because you've been doing a series on this, and there's a lot to know, and like Kent said, financially and everything like that, you need to have a plan in place. And as we've talked about legally, to jump to your side really quick, I mean, you have to be put in place as their designated caregiver, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, a number of documents that are vital to get you through this season without too much interference from lawyers and judges. And so that you can make your own decisions about how you want things to go.
Well, and like you guys have been touching on, it's like, okay, financials, where do they live? You know, all that stuff has to be taken into consideration. Medical, do you want to put them in a facility? Would some be better in a facility or home care? I mean, that's got to be huge decisions that are made.
Right, they are, and where the emotional comes in is, and from my experience, most parents would say, I don't want to be in a facility. Don't ever put me in a facility. I will haunt you if you put me in a facility. All those kinds of things.
I will disown you if you put me in a facility, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the adult children have some huge emotional obstacles to deal with. And then it becomes challenging because of the dementia. Mom and dad are losing the ability to reason. And so they're stuck in that moment, and they're stuck with the past thoughts of, don't ever put me in a facility. And it may be better for mom and dad to be in a facility, but because of the dementia, mom and dad can't reason and understand the whole importance of going into the facility. So there's a huge emotional issues that go on back and forth.
And I was just going to say the emotional impact on the caregivers, and we're going to talk more when we come back about being a caregiver, but the emotional impact on the caregivers could be very great.
Right, and then there's the spouse.
Right,
the spouse is trying to be the caregiver.
Right, yeah, and for the spouse, it's an issue of the marriage vows. I promise to be there for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. And if I'm not the one that's doing it, then somehow I failed, kind of a thing. So yeah, there's a lot of emotional stuff.
And when we come back from the break, we are going to talk about if you're a caregiver. And Catherine, you and I have kind of touched on this before, but it goes pretty deep. Some don't even realize they are a caregiver. And that's a big thing to face, isn't it? And we'll talk about that when we come back. We're talking with Catherine Hammond from Hammond Law Group and special guest Kent Mathews, who's with the Area Agency on Aging on the Extra on KRDO News Radio. Welcome back to the Extra on KRDO News Radio. Today we are talking about what to do when a loved one has dementia, has been diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's. And joining me, Catherine Hammond from Hammond Law Group. And really quick, Catherine, we've talked about this before, but you have a series now on addressing this.
Yes. Kent Mathews and I have partnered together on something called the Caregiver course, specifically to help people with a loved one with any kind of dementia plan for all of the legal, financial, medical, emotional, and housing issues.
And Kent, you are, Kent Mathews is with the Area Agency on Aging, and you actually work very closely with a lot of folks that are dealing with this.
Yes, my primary responsibility at the Area Agency on Aging is to meet with family caregivers, talk about the caregiving situation, and then identify resources for them to use that will help them, how to access those resources, and then begin thinking about a plan. So what's going to happen? You're in here now, this is what's going on, but what's going to happen as things continue to progress, which is my gentle way of saying when things get worse.
So let's start with just the basics of being a caregiver. And Catherine, the last time you were here, we kind of touched on this. It is very hard for some caregivers, isn't it, for them to even acknowledge or emotionally accept that I am now a caregiver.
Right. And I think this is something that Kent first pointed out to me. How many people come into his office as a spouse or an adult child who don't even realize that they're a caregiver?
Right, because they're doing what they think they should be doing as the spouse, as the husband, as the wife, or as the adult child. I first noticed it when I would get phone calls from people who would say they were a neighbor and they were concerned about the neighbor next door, and that they were, taking them to the store, helping them get their meds, helping them with some light housekeeping inside, and they were doing all of this stuff. And then when I would say, so you're a caregiver for them, they'd say, oh, no, I'm not a caregiver. I'm just a neighbor. I'm just helping out.
No, you're a caregiver.
Yeah, but
right. They don't see it that way. Yeah.
Right. And that's when I first became aware of how most people don't see themselves or identify themselves as caregivers, which is why it takes them so long to get to the point where they need to realize they need to do some planning. They need to be doing some thinking ahead, because they're just responding to the need of another person. And it seems to be going well, but the pressure's building, but they're just, they're doing what they're supposed to do.
And I'm sure a lot of the not accepting that they're a caregiver has to do with emotional, like, especially if it's a spouse or an adult child, right? Like, I don't want to say can't accept that my parents may be suffering from Alzheimer's, or my aunt or my uncle or my grandparents. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot emotionally attached to that.
Right, there is. And then on the reverse end of that, if they've been caring for a long time, I've had spouses in my office who are exhausted physically and emotionally, and they're saying, I don't feel like I'm his wife anymore. I don't feel like I'm the husband. I'm just this person who's helping give them care. And part of the reason that they feel that way is because the dementia has progressed, and the person with the dementia, the spouse, doesn't see them as the husband or the wife.
Right.
They're just another person.
And might even really resent them.
Right.
Exactly.
Might be really mean.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I've seen this before with friends and who have experienced this as well. And their level of frustration, and you just hit on it, Kent, their level of frustration just went through the roof, because, again, they did just become a person. But I think the constant forgetfulness or doing certain things that person would have never done before,
right.
It creates, again, the emotional stuff and even frustrations and everything, and they take it out of, that's my parent, or, again, my
right.
relative, or and it kind of makes it frustrating.
And here's another subtlety that adds to the frustration. Because if other people, like other adult children or neighbors or friends, know that they're in that caregiving situation kind of a thing, the conversation isn't about, for the caregiver, how are you doing?
Right.
It's always, how's Frank doing?
Yeah.
How's your wife doing? And so all of the conversation is about how they're doing, and very rarely do they ask, so how are you doing?
So what does that mean for someone who is in this caregiving position? What is the most important thing for them to do then? Again, I besides acknowledging I am a caregiver, but what is another really important thing for them to do for themselves, besides preparing and acknowledging?
Well, one of the things we talk about in the new series that we've produced is throwing expectations out the window. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that we talk about is you have to shift your thinking, and you have to take care of yourself first.
And a lot of caregivers, I bet, don't do that, do they?
Our society hardwires our brains to be thinking about other people first in everything. Think about somebody else first, and then think about yourself second. But in order to survive this caregiving journey, the caregiver has to flip that on its ear, and they have to start taking care of themselves first. They have to. It goes back to the old analogy of, when you're flying and you're backing out from the gate and you're going through all the safety procedures, and they say if the cabin decompresses suddenly, the air masks will drop. You put yours on first before you assist the person next to you. That's the mentality that caregivers have to have.
Right.
Assist themselves first before they assist their caregiver.
And it's maybe the very hardest thing for caregivers to do.
I was going to say, I bet both of you have seen that, where it's probably one of the hardest things ever for them to go.
Right.
Well, and you know that from personal experience, Catherine.
Right. And so we've tried to give people some basic tools for how that can look in your life. And it's very much a practice. We're never going to perfect it, but there are certain things that we can do and set up in our lives to help build some of that in. And one of those things is some accountability and some support around us.
So having the support and somebody holding, like, okay, are you taking, like, an accountability buddy, basically, kind of thing? Yeah.
Right. And ideally, that person who's your accountability buddy is the person who has some previous experience or understands that in caregiving. Whether that's somebody from a support group that you seem close to, or whether that's a close friend who gets it and wants the best for you and is able to help you then take care of yourself. Because it's easy, even for the well-meaning friend, to say something, but it's the wrong thing.
Right. If they say the wrong thing, sometimes it can be not helpful sometimes.
Exactly.
And we are just touching on a small portion of the series that you guys put together on what to do when a loved one has dementia or Alzheimer's. And when we come back, we're going to dive in a little bit more about planning, especially when it comes to housing and care. Sound good? And we'll do that when we come back on The Extra on KRDO News Radio. Welcome back to The Extra on KRDO News Radio. Today we're talking with Catherine Hammond from Hammond Law Group and Kent Mathews with Area Agency on Aging. And we're talking about, you both came out with a series of basically what to do when you have a loved one that is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, dementia, that kind of thing. And it's quite a process. And you have a whole series on it. And we are just kind of barely touching on the tips of all of this right now. And I did want to, and we kind of mentioned it before, but I kind of want to dive into it deeper about housing. That can become a real decision. And like we were touching on earlier, you guys, where you're, as an adult caregiver, you might be thinking, well, they'd be better served in a care facility. And then there's some emotional stuff that's put on with that. So what are the best things to approach when looking at, and there's no generalization to this, I know, but when looking at housing and care options?
Yeah, I'd say big picture, the most important thing is to figure out what your options are.
Okay.
Ideally, as early as possible, ideally ahead of time. And then stay flexible because needs are going to change and we don't know exactly what path anybody's dementia progression is going to take.
It's always changing.
Right.
And then the other part of that is know the money, because what you can have, when you can have it, how you can have it is all based on the availability or inavailability of the money. Usually when caregivers come in to my office, I just, there's a number of questions I always ask, but the two I always ask is, so what is mom or dad's monthly income approximately, and what's the level of their assets approximately? Because then that tells me what I can tell them about the resources in the community. So if they're thinking about, mom continuing to live at home, but having a home care agency come in to help her with stuff, great idea and it works, but it's more difficult to make that happen if mom doesn't have a lot of money to be able to do that. So a lot of the housing issues and how you solve those problems really kind of hinge on the money issue.
And so, like you're saying, stay at home caregivers as to going into care facility, that's a big decision, and financially, without bankrupting yourself or everything like that. Right. And you have to see what resources are available.
Right.
Also, I'm sure in consideration in all of this, and we're kind of jumping back to that, what are their desires? Mm-hmm. But you guys kind of made the point earlier, like, well, in that moment that they said, if you put me in a care facility, I will disown you and never speak to you again. That was a while ago. That moment happened
a while ago.
Right. So it's hard, I bet, being respectful of their desires, but also the best care for them and you as a caregiver.
Right. And the other part of that is when mom and dad were saying that, it was based on impressions that they had developed of care facilities 20, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they were saying what they were saying. But the care facilities of today are good. They have their challenges. They provide good care. But they're not the same as what mom and dad remembered 20, 30 years ago, kind of a thing. So you have to hit that balance, and you have to honor them as much as possible. But sometimes what I tell or ask the caregivers is, and this sounds a little strange, is maybe the best way to honor mom and dad is to have them in the facility.
Well, and that's just it. Yeah. I mean, how do you go from, say they started in the home, and I'm sure it all depends on progression, right? But I'm sure it would be hard if they were first at home to then decide, I need to move them to a facility. Right. I'm sure there's a lot that goes into deciding that, but that's got to be a big decision to make as well.
Well, and one of the things that I knew about my mom, she had the world's biggest heart. She wanted the best for everybody else. And so I when I put her into a nursing home, I was not in a position at 22 to be able to take care of her full time. I had to work. And then when I was 25, I had my first baby. So it wasn't an option for me. But my mother, I was very clear the whole time, would have wanted my quality of life over her own preconceived notions about what she wanted for housing. I was more important to her than she was. And so I think she very much would have wanted me to make that decision. I didn't have a choice at that point in my life.
Right.
But it's exactly what she would have wanted for me.
And that's the other thing, isn't it, Kent? Like sometimes there's just no choice in the, I mean,
exactly.
There's no choice.
Exactly. Because, and so there are times where I'll ask the caregiver, so if you continue on this route and don't want to consider the hard emotional options of placing them in a facility, so how well will you have succeeded as a caregiver if you wind up putting yourself in the hospital because of some major physical problem that was created from the overexhaustion from the caregiving, or you die from it? I mean, I do have pretty much every year, I could maybe a handful of like 4 or 5 caregivers who I know died before the family member they were giving care to. And see, that's
because of exhaustion or whatever happened.
And because they're putting their care receiver first and not taking care of themselves.
Oh my gosh.
And then, like Catherine was saying, I will sometimes challenge the caregiver and say, so if Dad knew that you were becoming physically sicker and emotionally exhausted from providing the care, for him, would he want you to do that?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I will raise that issue and to try to begin to, I got to break through their preconceived notions.
That I have to do this.
Exactly.
And it has to be done this way.
Exactly. And
And
so
all the
that's what I work at.
guilt.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of it is guilt.
Right.
Absolutely. And here's an interesting question that you guys have here, and there is putting air quotes around this. It's a scary thought, though. Can someone be put away, and I hate that term, but put away because they are no longer safe in their home or apartment? I mean, maybe a family member, maybe they don't want to go live with somebody, but it's getting so bad. Can they be put away? And again, I'm using air quotes around that.
And
That's
Catherine,
a hard term.
And see, Catherine and I both deal with this, and on a daily basis, I deal with it from a social work perspective. She deals with it from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
But what we've discovered is there's some common ground.
Okay.
Technically, they can't.
They cannot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because, and the way I explain it to caregivers is, in our society with our values and the Constitution and everything, safety does not trump self-determination. Just because a person has dementia doesn't take away their rights as an individual.
Correct.
Which means they can make bad, very bad decisions.
Even possibly life-threatening decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And put themselves in jeopardy, or, put their other people in jeopardy, that kind of a thing. But that doesn't give the legal system the right to, or anybody to step in and say, we're putting you away because you're not safe.
Right.
There's a process for that.
Although, right, society and the legal system, I think, haven't fully caught up with this thinking. We've traditionally thought that safety trumps quality of life. But Kent and I are both really passionate about people making their own decisions around that. And for me personally, I would much rather have a shorter life and live how and where I want to, even if it means I'm going to die years earlier, than to live a longer life that's not how I want to be living. Quote unquote, locked up in a home, not able to do the things that I want to do. For me, quality of life absolutely trumps quantity.
And that's where, again, you step into legal things right there, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
And you have to make sure that is predetermined
and
it's touchy.
Right. And then with the legal system, that, you get the courts involved, and that's the guardianship, conservatorship process, and probate and all of that kind of stuff. So, it's in order to limit somebody's rights, it's a court legal process.
Yeah. We could keep talking about that for a long time, couldn't we?
Yes.
But when we come back from the break, we are going to touch on some of the medical issues associated with this and what that can lead to as well. We're talking with Catherine Hammond from Hammond Law Group and Kent Mathews with the Area Agency on Aging. What to do if you're caring for someone with dementia, Alzheimer's, next on the Extra on KRDO News Radio. Welcome back to the Extra on KRDO News Radio. We will get back to talking with Catherine Hammond from Hammond Law Group and Kent Mathews with the Area Agency on Aging about what to do if you're a caregiver with somebody with dementia. But first, time to check in with Mike Lewis.
Hey, Renee, good morning. Just wanted to give you a quick update. We have landed in Denver at Centennial Airport. KRDO News Radio sponsoring the Pikes Peak Regional Air Show. I got the ride of my life in a B-25 Mitchell right behind the pilots. Some of the photos are posted on our KRDO News Radio Facebook page. We also had an escort, a Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. Had a great time. It was a great flight. We'll be heading back to Colorado Springs in just a little bit. If you see the planes flying overhead here within an hour or so, that's what it is as we head back to the Colorado Springs airport. And again, exciting time. Check out our Facebook page. Renee, back to you.
Okay, so Catherine Hammond and Kent Mathews talking about a very important topic today, and that's caring for. You guys put together a series, and we'll touch on where can they get the series of info, because we are just barely touching like the surface here. I know we are, because there's a lot to get into, but where can they take part in this series? Or is it like a class they can come to? How do they get involved?
Yes, so it's a full video course that resides online that's going to be released in the next couple of weeks. If you go to thecaregivercourse.com, you can see some of the preview videos and register so that you will be notified as soon as it's released for sale.
That's fantastic. And you said in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
It'll be ready. Okay.
It will.
Perfect. And before we have a few minutes left, you guys, and I know, again, we're just barely scratching the surface with some of this, but really medical issues is a big driver in all of this, isn't it? When it comes to dementia, Alzheimer's, it's what happens medically, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So they may be diagnosed, and as we've talked about, it could be very difficult, but the progression could change things either very quickly or maybe it might take more time for others.
Exactly. From a medical standpoint, the progression of the dementia on the physical body is, I think, best described as more like a regression in terms of the brain function, but the body eventually, irregardless of what's causing the dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, what will eventually happen is the person becomes total care. Mm-hmm. They in the really end stages, they can't do anything for themselves, so they need to be completely dressed. They need to be fed.
Right.
Somebody needs to do all the bathing, that kind of thing. And usually, when they're getting into that stage, is when the physical care becomes the most exhausting. That's often when people hit the breaking point. But it's also the time to really consider getting hospice care involved.
Yeah, and hospice care is, that's when you're looking at end of life.
Right.
But you get help.
Exactly. And you have, basically with hospice care, you have a team of people that come into the house, for paid professionals, a registered nurse, a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, a social worker, a chaplain, and then a volunteer, if you would like to have the volunteer, to help come in and provide that total care. The nurse becomes the eyes and ears for the doc, and there's a lot of advantages to having that nurse coming in. And then the CNA is coming in to help with some of the physical care. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful program. It helps people to learn how to begin to regain the quality of life that had been lost, rather than focusing on the quantity. And one of the reasons I did hospice work for as long as I did was because of that whole issue of we were helping family members regain quality in their life, helping the patient have quality. Even though with dementia, they weren't aware of what's going on, we were able to provide and help everybody with that quality of life issue.
Absolutely, which is so important. especially towards the end. Now, I see a quick question here. What is, as speaking of medical stuff, IADLs and ADLs?
Oh, yeah. So, so IADLs, it stands for Instrumental Activities of Daily Living.
Okay.
There's 7 of them. And they deal with managing money, shopping, taking meds, preparing meals, housework, and using the phone.
So if these are things that you need to look at medically speaking with your the person that is dealing with this.
Yeah. So usually when a person with dementia, and then the other one on activities of daily living, I'll get to that. But usually the progression is when a person has dementia or any kind of chronic disease, but especially with dementia, you will start to see their inability to do stuff. Like, they were the person who did the budget. They were the person who managed the checkbook. And now all of a sudden, they can't do that anymore. Or when they're shopping, somebody's got to be with them so they don't start just pulling something off of the shelf and putting it into that kind of stuff.
Right.
So when that begins to happen, then that's an indication they're losing their independence.
Okay.
Now, and that's another psychological issue. But anyway, so in the early stages of dementia, you start losing 1 or 2 of those, and then as the dementia progresses, you go heavier into that list. Mm-hmm. So it gets to the point where the person with dementia can't do those basic daily activities.
Right.
That, managing and running a household is basically the IADLs. The ADLs move into the more personal care. That's the bathing, the dressing, the toileting, the mobility. Do they need help getting around? Transferring. Do they need help getting in and out of beds? Eating is the physical act of feeding themselves, not preparing the meals, but feeding themselves. And so as the dementia progresses and they get heavier into the IADLs, then they start to lose the ability to do the ADLs.
Right.
Where they're not taking a bath because they don't remember to take a bath. So somebody has to remind them to take a bath, or somebody has to remind them to dress or pick out their clothes, that kind of stuff. And then in the end stage of dementia, the person cannot do any of the IADLs and none of the ADLs.
Got it.
And they're basically a chair to bed to chair existence.
It's hard to hear all of that, isn't it? And you guys, we've run out of time today. We could talk about this for a very long time, but again, I want to emphasize your series is coming out in a couple of weeks, and to see more about it, go to the caregivercourse.com. And again, we just touched on just the surface of this, and there's a lot more in the Caregiver course, right?
Tons.
Yes.
Yeah. So make sure and check it out. Again, it'll be released at the end of the month.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Catherine Hammond, thank you. Hammond Law Group, Kent Mathews with Area Agency on Aging. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And coming up tomorrow, how bad is the opioid problem in our area? Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Leon Tully will be here with us on The Extra on KRDO News Radio.